Okay, good evening, everybody. Hello there. Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Good evening. Welcome. It's nice to see so many people here. It was a icky, miserable day, so it's particularly nice to have a nice, crowded, warm, cozy room. Tonight is the Timothy Egan Lenahan Memorial Lecture, an annual event at the School of Architecture. The lecture is an endowed series funded by the family and friends of Tim Lenahan, Yale College class of 1980 and Yale School of Architecture class of 1984. He was brilliantly talented, and very sadly, his career was cut short by his death in 1994. And we are grateful to his family for the creation of the endowment that supports this lecture, as well as for their ongoing generosity to and support of the school. Many of the Lenahan lectures have been leading practitioners in the field of landscape architecture, including Michael van Valkenburg, Walter Hood, Margie Ruddick, and Kate Orff. Prominent historians and theorists have also given Lenahan lectures, including Michael Sorkin and Alessandro Ponte, and there have been educator practitioners like Charles Waldheim, Mik-Young Kim, and Sarah Zudi. And it is a real honor for me to add Beka Sturges to the list. In addition to being an accomplished practitioner, she is a wonderful and beloved member of our faculty. Beka Sturges is also a partner and principal of the noted landscape architecture firm Reed Hilderbrand, and she leads their New Haven office. Beka did her undergraduate work at Sarah Lawrence College, stuck her toe into doctoral studies at Princeton in English literature. I bet most of you did not know that. And then received a master's degree in landscape architecture from the GSD at Harvard. Before joining Reed Hilderbrand, she worked at the office of Michael van Valkenburg. In addition to teaching here at Yale, Beka has taught at Connecticut College, the Ohio State University Knowlton School, Penn State, and Wesleyan. The breadth of Beka's work is impressive as she works on private projects on the campuses of major universities, public parks and trails, and planning projects of all scales. The work includes projects at Brown University, Duke University, here at Yale and Williams College, museums, collections, and study centers, including Dumbarton Oaks, the George O'Keeffe Museum, Santa Fe, the Clark Art Institute, and the Storm King Art Center, and public projects including the half-mile line in the Berkshires and the Mill River Trail Plan here in New Haven. Beka's work has won numerous design awards from the American Society of Landscape Architects, the Boston Society of Landscape Architects, and the Connecticut Society of Landscape Architects, and the Architects Newspaper Landscape Design Awards, among many others. She's lectured at many ASLA conferences and university symposia, and it gives me a truly great pleasure to welcome her to speak on her work at the School of Architecture tonight. Her talk is entitled Fair Play. Please give Beka a really warm welcome.
Okay, deep breath. Good evening, everyone. I'm so glad to be together with you tonight. And I really want to thank everyone for coming. And I really want to particularly thank my students. I hope you can stay awake. I know it was already a long day and night. To my Reed Hilderbrand friends, for your immeasurable support and imagination. And to all the extraordinary people who make the School of Architecture a place for ideas, for experimenting, and for lifelong relationships. I wanted to start today by talking about play. The creativity, the freedom, the joy that play releases. And I want to acknowledge some things about play. Often, there's a condition of safety and choice. You can play or not play. My sense is that we are all looking today for a way forward in a very scary time, and that we need to forge a future with rules we can all agree to and lose ourselves in. and that being alive is not passive, and we need to act together. I want to take inspiration from designers who have come before, like Cornelia Oberlander, the great Canadian landscape architect who believed in play and invented new ways to connect children to the natural world. She was not afraid of risk, and I think that seems extremely relevant at this moment. Rebecca Solnit, one of our wisest people, writes, "When fear arises, it means that we're at the edge of what we're willing to be with, what we're willing to accept. And I believe play can help us through fear, help us be brave, which feels necessary today." Living in New Haven, we're held by the amazing cliffs of East and West Rock. Our city is organized by some rivers that we mostly don't see. This is a beautiful photo of the Mill River after it leaves East Rock Park and before it connects to the harbor. One of our first projects after we opened the New Haven studio here 10 years ago was the Mill River Framework Plan. And we realized that most people in town couldn't locate it. And the reasons for its invisibility are various, our history of urban redevelopment, highway construction, redlining, but all of those things contribute to the river serving as an invisible and segregating barrier between neighborhoods and resources. And so to think about how we could have an outreach event that would bring the different communities together to think about the river and its presence and maybe new life in the city, we hosted a set of events where I don't think we could do this today, but we made a game of Twister out of the Mill River with that in the center, and we had people put hands where they lived and feet where they went to school or worked, and it created all sorts of new conversations and relationships. So we're living in this moment where we know we have to change the basic understanding of how we live together, and where the violences that came before shape our days and future so powerfully that we can't hide from a close look at our history and how it impacts our present. We need to find new ways to understand freedom and our environment. As a practice at Reed Hilderbrand, we continue to try to understand and draw through the overlapping histories we live with. This is a set of drawings, or part of a set of drawings that we made a few years ago to try and map and think about the unceded lands that we live and work on. We also try to pay attention to human motivations that drive us and the organizations we serve. We're particularly curious about how to build circles of care and even love. This is a drawing that I look at every day by Leonardo da Vinci, and it inspires me to continue to pay attention to the people around me and to find shared purpose. It is hard to comprehend how strong the forces are that drive people, and we try to listen to both the stated intentions and the unstated motivations. We are also keenly aware that we are a planet moved by forces that are larger than even our solar system. This is a recent photograph from the James Webb Space Telescope, and the reality that there is still so much in our earthbound way that we don't know keeps what we can do in perspective. But as designers and builders, the known forces of gravity and our Earth in ceaseless motion govern our work. We seek to make a world where humans and plants, rocks and rivers can all flourish. And together with our communities, with our clients, with each other, we identify goals and solutions. And I just want to say, that's all of you together, right? It's not just the people at Reed Hilderbrand or our clients. It's all of those of us who are in conversation together. So this is an image from our work at Buffalo Bayou down in Houston, which is a project where we are just one team amongst many SWAs leading a very large plan to reconnect the city to the quite dangerous flooding conditions. And I think one of the things that's interesting about this kind of ecological urbanism project that we are very much a part of in our practice, but just one player amongst many, is the sheer volume of people, plants, waters that we all need to manage going forward. I think the need for gardens and oases, even in these larger systems and places, is absolutely critical. So this is an image of one of our 4 gardens that we've worked on. And the idea that civic horticulture can relate to the scale of these much larger systems is something we believe in keenly. We're a practice of 70 people brought together by our desire to reconcile human and natural forces. And I think of us as having a practice of attention and even love for the world. We mostly work nationally, but there are some communities and places that we are particularly bound to. Boston, New Haven are where our main studios are, but also Maine and Texas, where we have excellent outposts. And we are very much better and happier because we have each other. So together we ask a lot of questions, we test endlessly, trying to find solutions that satisfy our standards of collective intelligence. There is not a single scale or typology or problem that we focus on. We seek to do work where we can really dig in and find beautiful solutions. And we believe in change. The expressive behavior of plants is an ally in this work. And this is a drawing that I love by artist Pat Pickett. And he's generated a whole series of drawings where plants, in this case a live oak in California, make drawings with a pen attached to a branch over a duration of time. This is, I think, roughly 3 hours or something. We learn from works like that to make drawings that try to sort of reorient our relationship to plants and to soil. And so this is a drawing we made for when we were competing for a project at Sojourner Truth Park on the Hudson, trying to suggest that the reclamation of this very toxic land and a life cycle of plants could start to produce the kinds of activities for people that they crave. So now I'm going to launch into a little series of mini chapters. The first one is everywhere, and that's just because I want to make a simple point tonight to all my beloved students that landscape is basically, the designed manipulated landscape is everything outside of your window. It's everything that you encounter when you open your door. And so a sidewalk, an alley, a parking lot, these are very much landscapes deserving of care and attention and design. And so super briefly, a project led by Dean Burke and Ten Burke at Next Haven that Ming has also participated in, an invitation to think about their sidewalk to be more meaningful to their communities. A very simple project, right, where we looked to just find a way to make a little living space for hanging out and events that would be very much part of the street, but also protected, and to make a place for soil for ginkgo trees along the sidewalk. And some of you will recognize Andrew strutting down the street. The next project is a project that we got to do with George Knight and his amazing team just around the corner for the Yale Center for Catholic Life at St. Thomas More. And this really, George said, I think maybe there's a project for you here, Beka. We have to make an accessible exterior connection. There's a parking lot. And so the invitation to take this very narrow piece of land and to make what really just was a required code, a required code condition into something so much more was a chance that we jumped at. And they feel that they have the most beautiful parking lot on the Yale campus. And so, this idea that you can have a garden and a ramp is something we believe in. And then I think something that happened is that this space turned into something that offered so much more to their community. And the last thing I would suggest is, right, that very small spaces can be places of replenishment and spirit. So the last little micro project here in New Haven is the reclaiming of a parking lot to make more parking. So this is over by our office just on Whitney Street, a project for Fred and Laura Clark. And the idea that we could sort of sandwich a grove of trees under a towering oak and take away 2 parking spaces from the sea of asphalt, still make a parking space for them and their 2 cars, but to have that space be also like a garden in its interiority and finishes. And so here you see that grove of trees that the home is nestled in, the roof of the carport. Andrew actually worked on this with us too. Uh-oh. Come on. Well, that just went awfully fast. Let's see if I can back up. I'll skip, actually. So I think just super briefly, when you're working in a really compressed space like this, operating vertically is really critical for a landscape. So I don't know why these are glitchy, so excuse me. The last second to last image here, but a really important one, particularly for the building project students in the room, is the idea that we can live very close in this sort of vertical way, and that you can have a window. The planting area between the between the street and this face of the building is only 3 feet. But we got a very tall line of trees, and so there are only almost cars that you see beyond these trees, but their everyday experience of washing the dishes is one of great beauty. And then I think there's some, sometimes very strange conditions that can emerge, but they are incredibly poetic. And so that's my last thought about the actions that are possible in very small spaces in, our immediate city. The next subject that I wanted to tackle is the idea of fragile land. And I think we have, unfortunately, an idea that once we know something is super delicate or super worrisome, we want to protect it. And the problem then, sometimes ironically, that happens is that we can't go there. And so we stop valuing it because we don't engage with it anymore, and we turn our backs on it, and it becomes background or worse, it becomes erased from consciousness and value. So this is a series of 3 projects that look at that issue in one way or another. The first is a wetland, and Deborah talked about this as Half Mile Line, which actually, unfortunately, is not really public. But this was a project that was prompted because half the property in the Berkshires owned by this family, they couldn't engage with it all, and they couldn't see it. And so they just asked a question of is there some way that this could have more meaning? And Gary Hilderbrand had, I think, a thought that yes, we could build a boardwalk that would take you into that resource. And so we embarked on a series of conversations with the Conservation Commission and a set of ecologists to find a way to lift up the boardwalk and to cause it to move amongst the plants and the water so that it never had any negative shadow effects or changed the temperature of the water. And it has produced this sort of environment where it often feels like people are walking on water. And the sort of sinuous up and down was all something that got sorted out to actually preserve all the life that is in that wetland. And some shots of the amazing people who worked with us to build this. It had to be hand done, and we used hemlock and black locust. And I think then there was this thing, you get these calls after you're really proud and you think you're done, and it's like, it's settling. You sort of failed. And we were so excited about our helical piles and how delicate they were and sensitive, and then the thing was settling. And so we said, well, can you put a camera up so we can figure out what's going on? And we discovered that we had not actually structurally engineered it for bears. So in the end, this is a very, in some ways, simple, but I think deep project that has motivated a lot of our work since we succeeded with it. So I'm going to move into a project where we took a lot of the lessons from that previous project. And so this is on an esker, which is like a thin worm-like, upland glacial form along the Connecticut River in New Hampshire. And so here, the condition that was protected was the riparian bank, which is good. It's very steep slopes, very fragile slopes. And the forest had been protected for more than 100 years, but the deed for this forest says that you can't touch it. And so everyone who lives along it had turned their back on the forest. And there are a set of issues sort of about that. And we said, well, let's try and think about that differently. And so this is the dock that we put in that leads you into that forest. And this is emerging out of that forest up on the plateau. And then this is a model, a sectional model, where you can see a pond on one side and the river on the other, and the very small amount of actually developable and livable, occupiable by humans land on the top. And so thinking about a way to develop a sort of landscape and architectural strategy together where the environment and the living conditions were actually greater always than the very actually large house that we ended up building. So where it says Bosque, it was really important to us that always the architecture and the home be held. And then this is the plan that we arrived at with a series of terraces and spaces for life in actually a very narrow suburban lot. And this is a home that we designed to meet institutional standards of access on this plateau, but where we also really committed to steps. So this is 53 steps up from the pond, and they're very comfortably integrated into the garden with a series of terraces. And we used local stone and tried to create a sense of a woodland stroll, even as you're working so hard to go up and down. And because it's basically a typical lot in its dimensions, we also worked hard with immersive and vertical plants to bring the plants in the sky close. There's small pools for birds all throughout the little bit of project. We did make a swimming pool, which is very popular with their children and people who come all the time. This also, I think, possibly featured. There's a new opening by Cara Romero, who's an amazing indigenous photographer, who's opening her first show at the Hood Museum just now, and she did a shoot in this pool. And then I think the most interesting part of the project, which gets really back to the half-mile line part, is this set of stairs that we built, which I think is 195 stairs. And we thought of them as part of this whole detailed set of connections and things that you can touch and look at and interact closely with. But this set of steps we needed to develop so that they had all these mobile and adaptable conditions, because we couldn't change the earth and we couldn't change any of the trees. And so we needed to adapt, and we needed to be able to continuously adapt going forward. And then let's see if this works. Uh-oh. Yes. And so this was quite a joy last year, because the owner sent us this video, and I thought, yes, we did it. The bears like this basically boardwalk just as much as they liked the last one. So then a little bit more complicated to talk about or think about is this project, which is a project that really is about a kind of ghost forest condition, which is a condition that we're all living with more and more, and a woodland. It's the Houston Arboretum project that we did with Design Workshop and Lady Bird Johnson Wildlife Center, and also Lake Flato. And this was a project where we were invited because they were an arboretum with all these wonderful trees, but they were at more than 50% tree mortality or tree loss. So that's a major problem if you're supposed to be all about trees, which is what an arboretum is. And so we worked with our lovely team to try and understand what was happening and what the Earth wanted to be and wanted to do. And I think that this is the kind of thing that we're all going to have to do a lot more with what we're seeing with the climate. And so this is a little bit complicated to interpret, but the big finding was that basically the soils here really wanted to be prairie and also wetland. And so then we talked with the client and amongst ourselves or the team, and this is a set of possible futures that we mapped out. And in the end, I think basically the idea of the woodland corridor and basically allowing the land to return back to prairie was where we found ourselves. And so I think just to say that, you know, sometimes you explore these things with a private or in a more experimental or perhaps precious or small scale. But I think a lot of the lessons, one of the reasons we love to work with individuals is that you can kind of investigate things in a very deep and clear way that then can become very influential for much larger issues or sort of more bureaucratic clients. Next series of projects that I'm going to talk about take on, I think, a different issue, which is we have mostly privatized land in the United States, particularly on the East Coast. And obviously, the people who have access to that land, it's not a, you know, it's a sort of predictable story about who has experiences with beautiful, powerful, large, expansive landscapes. It's not a fair distribution of that kind of experience. And so we've been really lucky to work with a series of organizations that are really committed to changing the relationship that people have with land. And so I'm going to start by talking about the Clark, but I'm also going to talk about our relationship with Williams College Museum of Art. And so these two projects that are down the street from each other in Williamstown, and then I'm going to close this little chapter, which is basically all about museums that are trying to offer land and art back to people by talking about a project that's just about to open at Storm King on the Hudson. So this is a plan of our project at the Clark. It shows the full 140-acre landholding, and you can start to see how we wound and twisted and terraced the roads and the parking and the water features and all the needs that they had as an organization into this forest and wetland and meadow condition. Williamstown is in a valley, but it has these amazing hills all around it. And trying to reorganize the towards its larger landholding was a priority. One of the interesting things about the community is you don't feel the rivers or the waters, but the reason it kind of exists as this valley and this amazing larger landscape is because of so many waters coming together. And so we tried to focus on that and not see it as a problem, but to see it as something that could become very enlivening. And so this is a very recent, actually, shot of the sort of core of the project at the Clark. And here, I think the question of how could the organization, the Clark, the Museum and Research Institute, be brought together even as it expanded? How could it come closer to itself even while it did that? And so this idea of turning the museum toward its landscape and towards its larger landholding was what was developed as a strategy. Tadeo Ando had an amazing idea, which he's had before, of using water as the device or experience to basically connect you to a larger world. And I think one of the things that we're often like, I don't know if it's really a criticism, but it sometimes feels that way. People say, well, you worked there? It doesn't seem like anything happened. And I think we've tried to take that as a compliment, although it doesn't always feel that way. And so one of the things that we're starting to do more and more is show before and afters, which is, a Humphrey Repton trick. But so this is showing a picture of the Clark in construction where you can see us developing the new circulation, the new arrival sequence, the new parking lot, and replacing the old parking and old arrival sequence, which sort of took you between the two buildings and ended in a wetland, and so cut you off and turned you back into the ugly part of the buildings as your arrival experience. And I think something just to say is, I think grading or the manipulation of landform isn't a terribly well understood art, but that's our favorite art. So here's another view of that parking lot, another view of sort of the changed organization and experience, with the idea that everything is turning you back to the meadow and to the hills beyond. One of the critical criteria for the project was that the building feel of the Berkshires. And Michael Conforti, who's a really dynamic director who led us through this project, insisted that the building be low. And I feel like in this shot, you can kind of see the way the land and the trees and the building do offer something that is unlike a lot of his other projects in its settledness. The Clark is in some ways very much a teaching and research organization, and the ways that I wanted to show this because you're mostly architects, but the ways that the interior experiences relate to the landscape experiences are really powerful, and I think we did help make them better. Part of what we learned with this project is an old idea, not such an American idea, of hiding your best asset. And that was something that was really important to the team at Ando, right? That when you came, you would be denied. And so people walk along this wall, and we planted some lovely elm trees. And then you go through actually sort of double doors that are a vestibule, and you come back outside. And pretty much everyone, not everyone, I would say 1 out of 3 people goes, ah! And so there's a sort of gift of a landscape that I think you can't appreciate if you almost don't have that denial before. And the terrace for the Clark has become a site of life all the time, and they keep their organization open 24/7 in terms of the site. And so these spaces, which tie back to their collection and bridge between their core purpose as an art organization and now their landscape, are really important and successful. I think one of the things that we brought very meaningfully to the Clark was the idea that actually walking in their woods could become a strategy for the campus. And that has really worked. And so we developed with them a whole set of trails with various degrees of difficulty. And the sense of coming in and out of light and woods and meadows, whether you're in a car, building bridges, or on foot, and maybe you don't feel totally safe in the full forest. These were, I think, really successful strategies. Also, back when we did this, the idea of not paving for parking or for the fire chief was quite radical and required a lot of negotiation. I think it's now something that we see a lot more. But the sense of terracing to just achieve the kind of use you needed was an important part of that earlier project. Also, really inventorying the plants that are there, right? So we did really careful study of the forest and what we were removing and what we could put back to make a healthier, more adapted forest. I wanted to show these old models of the grading that we did just to give an example, just so you could see a little bit more closely how those terraces worked to minimize the degree of clearing that we needed to achieve to make this new part of the campus. And then a strategy of using pioneer plants to create sort of scrims that then, should have fixed that slide, led us to a sort of similar strategy for the parking for the larger project down the hill. And I think a simple lesson that we brought from the first part of this project was that we should work with the engineers and we should combine and bridge from a procurement point of view. This may be a little technical for most people, but that we should make the buyout one where you couldn't just do the civil work without the landscape. That had been a failure in the first part of the project. There was no accountability from the civil or the first part of the contract to the end. And so this part of the project was much more beautifully integrated. And in the end, I think this is a diagram that we did with Gensler to really talk about breaking down the divide between building systems and landscape systems. This was considered, I think, very groundbreaking at the time, and I actually have yet to work on a project that has been so committed to the sense that all the systems and all the infrastructure need to be conceived as one. And we actually produced net cost savings for the project with this strategy. We always had to price it against conventional methods, and I think if the cost hadn't worked in our favor, I'm not sure we would have succeeded. And then I thought I would these are very old drawings at this point, but show the sort of green infrastructure strategies that we used. And then the outcome of those, which is that you don't really experience between the grading and the strategies, the sense that there's parking right behind your head or that it's just an embedded part of the experience here, but mostly it's background. And the last slide is just to say, we sized everything with the water feature to minimize the mechanical. And the water source itself was the dewatering from the basement. It's a sort of self-circulating system. But one of the beautiful moments of sort of finding that solution to minimize mechanical drivers was the degree of performance that we've ended up in terms of play and theatrical and intimate conversations on those stepping stones. So to talk now about WICMA, we initially were invited to work at Williams because they thought that they were not doing a good job with their landscape. And they said, we actually know we can do better because we can just walk down the street and see what you did at the Clark. So we think somehow you have to tell us what we're doing wrong. And the answer was actually kind of straightforward. They had done what a lot of organizations are doing, which is to meet their accessibility goals, they had started just leveling everything. But the whole quality of what's beautiful about this landscape is that it rolls and it undulates, and there's a lot of movement of the ground. And so when they were leveling that and then they were building very thermally efficient buildings that had giant mass, they were creating all these dead ends and cutting themselves off from the landscape that makes Williams so kind of meaningful for so many people. So this is a simple diagram that we generated working with them to sort of summarize the issue that they had, which is that they're disconnected from their ecological edge and that they don't really have a clear strategy for the space between that ecology and their campus core. And so again, we returned to trying to think about the rivers and the hills that actually structure the campus. And then this is just a plan looking at the first project that we've gotten to work with them on, which is actually a bridge to that ecological edge. And so this is a project we're doing with soil, which has been really quite fun. We just completed our 100% CDs. In this project right here, you can see the campus map, the location along Hemlock Brook, which is the same brook that the Clark is on. We began by doing an ecological assessment and trying to understand what was healthy in the woods that they had. The finding was basically nothing. It was so much worse than anyone had predicted. And then this is where we are now with a strategy to produce much more biodiversity, much greater ecological vitality, also much wider array of experiences. This is still a very large Williams building, as you can see from the roof. But the idea is that it is constantly reconnected to nature. There are a couple of things that I think also I wanted to highlight that we did that we haven't ever done before, and that are sort of lessons learned from the two Clark projects. One is the idea that we think we're succeeding with of doing early planting. And so basically limiting an area where the architectural project needs to happen, but then saying there's a whole area where we can plant and we can improve and we can get started, and it'll be so much less expensive if we do that now. So we have early planting going in with bare root material to reforest and diversify the edge this spring. And we have been working closely to trial having true native species diversity, sourcing from different nurseries so that all the plants aren't just clones. And then additionally, something that we're even more excited about is that we think that this project is going to be the first project in the United States to use meadow sod, which is something that they've been using in the UK. But one of the giant challenges that often projects have particularly campus projects or institutional projects have when they want to be more biodiverse is the recommendation is build a meadow, but meadows take 3 or 5 years to establish. And so in the end, they end up just putting down turf and lawn sod. So our hope is that with this strategy for unrolling carpet of meadow, we will be able to change that future and create a much more robust ecology. And we're piloting a test across the street right now with the Williams facility. So we're hoping it'll be successful. So these are just a couple of views. This is as you approach from campus through that meadow. This is from the park and the Clark to the south. This is the idea that you're now in the woodland garden, and so this is the ADA parking, and then this is up from the parking lot through bioinfiltration meadows, and then at the heart, a very small courtyard to return light and plants to the center of the experience. And then there are a number of breakout spaces that open out from the series of pavilions to turn you back to the landscape. Okay, so that is a sort of story of Williamstown and working for a little bit more than 20 years in one town and building up relationships. I think our relationship at Storm King is a little bit younger, but not that much younger. It's coming on 10 years. Extremely excited to have Amy Weiser, one of the deputy directors, here in the room with us tonight. And I think Storm King is an amazingly inspiring organization. And a place that is situated on the Hudson in a location that's very important for the environmental history of America. And so you can see here it is on the Munda Creek, feeding into the Hudson. Storm King has a long history of land art and trying to think about being an open-air museum and really connecting artists and people with nature. It also has a long history of accepting that it used to be partly a gravel mine for the thruway that passes right along it. And so these made landforms and these made meadows and the practice of actually burning to prevent invasives and have a healthy ecosystem, these are all things that actually Storm King has done way before most organizations, and they really have been a leader in both design and ecological management. They first invited us to, maybe it wasn't the first invitation. The first invitation we succeeded in being accepted for, or whatever, was an opportunity to help them rethink a failed alley designed and very artistic alley that William Rutherford, who was their landscape architect for about 45 years, had put in. But the trees, you can see the large maples at the end of the image, were all dying. And so we worked with them to come up with a strategy to have a succession to this beautiful gesture, and we suggested a different species. Part of what is amazing about working with Storm King is the deep love artists have for them and their commitment to both emerging and established artists. And so Jean Shin, who is an incredible artist that I recommend to you, she took the dead trees that we'd had to fell because they were sick, and she made this table called, or this work called Alley Gathering, which was a site for all sorts of fun and joy for the next summer. This is a simple map of the set of projects we've done with Storm King since 2016. And I'll talk just about a few of them, but it's very much an iterative process, and there are different opportunities, and we work across scales and in all sorts of ways with them. Pretty much anything they ask us to do, we are excited to do. One of the amazing opportunities we had was to get to work with Martin Puryear to help him make one of the most extraordinary commissions of his life as accessible as it possibly could be. So we worked on this paving pattern and drainage strategy with him. And so far, I think it's been a success. The project itself, Martin's work, look out, I cannot recommend enough, and I think you should all go if you haven't. This is a quick diagram looking at mostly the capital project that we're working on right now that is also, that is going to open in May of this year. And just trying to identify some of the small pieces that we've done. The biggest piece and the most important part of the capital project was the idea that Hennigan Peng and WXY and Storm King had of taking cars out of the center of their whole landholding and consolidating them to make the visitor experience much more straightforward. But how you make a giant parking lot not feel like Walmart and actually produce positive ecological effects is an interesting question. So this is a plan of the detailed part of the project. I think one of the really beautiful ideas that the architects had was basically to say, couldn't, in this place of great landscape, couldn't actually the arrival be through landscape? And so we worked with them to make what is an outdoor welcome lobby. And I thought it might be useful to show the previous condition next to the it's now the new existing condition. And you can see how we daylit the stream and reconnected the project to its waters, but also this idea of really inhabiting the forest frame as the experience that you have as your primary experience when you come. And then with just a little bit more detail, one of the things that Storm King is committed to with this project is to have a superlative visitor experience for everyone who arrives. And pretty much the first thing that everybody needs to do when they arrive is go to the bathroom. So this is a really simple project where you can get a ticket, you can be oriented, you can be made to feel really comfortable and welcomed, and you can go to the bathroom. And we got to bring plants and the idea of the wetland and the forest up close with this project. And so these are some recent photographs of the not yet open project, but of this idea that even these bathrooms are not conditioned, right? It's actually, well, the bathroom, the stalls are, but the rest of it, you can wash your hands and you can look out and really appreciate this wetland and forest. And just a few quick images about the idea of daylighting the stream and removing the parking and what that opens up. Diagram of that. This is not a good image of the before, but you can see the parking and the gates. And then this is an image from the summer after we had removed the parking and the kinds of qualities that this new landscape will have that you can just start to see coming forward. So to my last chapter, the idea of shared ground. I think I have a kind of giant plea for all of us that we understand the world as something and a place, I guess, as something shared and a place of kinship. And I think one of the places that we've gotten to most beautifully design a future for that kind of experience or belief maybe to be understood is at Long Dock, basically just across the river from Storm King. This is a place that had incredibly complicated and contaminated site because of its rail yard use before we started to work there. Scenic Hudson had invited us to work on this project, which we did with ARO and Adam Urinsky. And I think the idea that we could have places of education, but more, I think, powerfully, we could bring people to the water, and that we could actually handle and change this contaminated site and still manage the floodwaters that are a routine part of life here on the Hudson. And so this is a completely invented wetland that helps manage those waters and floods. This is one of the walks that makes sense of the old pier, and then this is the experience of being close to the water that is now available at this beautiful park. So finally, to close out tonight, I think we have another amazing project that's going to open in May. It's up in Maine, at the very edge of our great continental forest. And it's called Dadaga. Oh, I got to read it. Dadaga. Oh, no, I practiced this so many times. Wait, Scott, help me say it, because I did say it 100 times. Dagaga Bimak. Sorry. Dagaga Bimak. Yes, okay. So this is a project, many people have heard of Mount Katahdin, but this is a project that we did and were sort of invited to do with the Wabanaki Nations and the National Park Service through the Elliottsville Foundation. And the idea was to take these 23 acres and to make a contact station to connect people with the land and the waters and the sky. The idea that this is one of the places at first dawn, and that there is an enormous need to recognize our connection to the forces of light and to the woods and waters. It's really important, motivating part. And everything that happened in terms of the design of this project was done with the Wabanaki Nations, right? And so recognizing their intellectual property and their commitment to their lands, I think has been a beautiful part of this project for everybody who has worked on it. And there's a modesty to the sort of surgical moves that we made to try and preserve as much as possible. So working with Saunders Architects, there's a beautiful building and there are these 23 acres to explore. But really the idea is that this is a place that connects you more deeply to the larger, expansive 88,000 acres that these sort of sacred lands are all about. And so the last point I would make is that I think there is a long-standing belief that you can be for the environment or you can be for shelter. And I think that is just an idea whose time is over. And so this is a call for thinking about environmental justice, but also thinking about how we make homes that are for all of our species, including our friends and loved ones. And with that, I want to say a giant thank you and see you upstairs. But I guess I have to take questions, right, Deborah?
Thank you for such a wonderful presentation. It's really quite a delight to see the projects that you've shown and discussed. I have a question that kind of harkens back to the title of your presentation, Fair Play, and maybe to focus a little bit about the fair parts of it. And I want to talk about the idea of fairness actually in relation to material and to the notion of waste, and also to what things and places want to be. I'm really, really moved, partly by your discussion of the Houston Arboretum project and how the land wants to be a certain way. You wanted to sense the nature of the place and let it be what it is. But I'm also really curious then about the idea of intervention and intervening in the making of landscapes. What happens to the things that you take out? What happens to the things that you subtracted so as to achieve, the kind of beautiful moments? And how do you work with this responsibly, in the moments that were not photographed, that were not picturesque? Thank you.
Brilliant question. It's a different answer every time, and it is a question we always ask. And so, when you're really lucky, you get to make something like that table with an amazing artist. In other times, you use the trees for mulch, or you actually keep all of the soil and you just put it back. I think as much as possible, like on Long Dock, we actually kept a lot of the concrete and we just cut it into different pieces and put it back. As much as possible, you put it back.
I'm curious, in designing within these fragile landscapes, as you labeled them, do you feel like there's ever a tension between, for example, wanting to replant native species, but sometimes because of climate change, these native species are no longer able to thrive within those biomes? So then sometimes, is it really about removing all the invasive species and putting in native? Or is it something that changes per project?
I think we're in a post-native world. I just think that the climate has changed so rapidly, and the degree of exchange that we have that's global. I think we are a planet, and we need to think like a planet. It actually seems very odd to me that landscape is a place where terms that I think you would not use in almost any other kind of conversation are still used with enormous pride and righteousness. So I think we do use the plants as much as we can that are of that place that we believe will thrive. And even sometimes plants that we don't think will thrive when we think that we have the kind of tender care that they require to keep them alive. But I don't think we think of it as an either-or thing. And even for one of our most, I would say, astonishingly leadership-y kind of client that we have, which is the Smithsonian Gardens in D.C., they don't want us to do 100% native. It's just not really a realistic way of thinking about planting anymore.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I had a question about time. Time is, of course, very relevant to both architecture and landscape architecture, but maybe much more acknowledged and visible in landscape architecture. And I'm curious if you have any advice or strategies that architects can sort of take from a practice that so much acknowledges time and understands that the idea that it's something isn't maybe completed at a certain time. Does that make sense?
I love your question. I guess I would say I think almost just to keep asking that question. Right? I mean, I think architecture changes too, but it's much more like a crazy growth spurt or something. It's like you stop and you go. Landscape never ever stops. And so I think sort of, but many things that are alive, in fact maybe all things that are alive, never stop. So I think just kind of remembering that, and also accepting death. I think one of the things that we're all most scared of is death, and I think that also isn't actually very helpful. Yes.
Wait till the microphone.
Well, first, thank you for a wonderful lecture. Two, I just want to second your enthusiasm for your work with Martin Puryear at Storm King. I see a lot of art, and that was one of the greatest things I've seen like in the past 10 years, that piece. It's just like, I shouldn't curse, but unbelievable.
You don't
And also the way that blends architecture, sculpture, landscape architecture, it is just outrageous. And congratulations. But something you said resonated with me based on my own experience as a practitioner working on institutional projects on steeply sloping sites that potentially required, that required making them accessible. And how to reconcile this imperative or commitment to access without what you were describing meant potentially leveling the site and removing all the great characteristics. I felt in the project I was working on, we began the project with a kind of mantra that as much as possible, everyone, individuals, friends, families, caregivers, should have the same experience together moving through the site. It backfired, and in the end of the day, the client, really elected or wanted to remove, things like stairs or level changes, all those qualities that made the landscape great. So I guess my concern, I don't know if you share it, is how can we be committed to accessible landscape and architecture without removing, the section and the site and what makes it potentially fantastic?
I think that's sort of our life's work as a practice. So I don't think I can answer that in an abbreviated way, particularly, except for to say that everybody should have access, but nothing should be killed, right? Nothing should be denied at the same time. And so I think one of the reasons we love terracing or stitching, there are all these beautiful kind of fabric or weaving metaphors that we use a lot, is the idea that, if you can wind, you can get there. It just may not be in the same temporal, it may take longer, but you can still get there.
Thank you, Beka, for this lecture. At the beginning, you started with a quote about the many things that we have destroyed or deprived ourselves in the name of freedom. I suspect that's not a version of freedom that you particularly subscribe to. So, how do you think of freedom? How do you think of freedom and its relation to your practice?
That's the hardest question so far. I think that's why I began with play. I think we all sort of need to find a kind of freedom. And I just think you can't, well, for me, and I think for the people I get to work with at Reed Hilderbrand, you can't destroy to find your freedom. It's like do no harm. It's the basic national park requirement.
On the note of don't destroy, we're going to end with questions. Let's give Beka a few rounds.